key public policy events, and every weekend the latest nonfiction authors and books on Book TV. You can see past programs and get our schedules at our websites. And you can join in the conversation on social media sites. Well, the U.S. Senate continues work today on the immigration bill. It increases border security and workplace enforcement. It allows additional high and low-skilled workers into the country, and it creates a 13-year path to citizenship for illegal immigrants who are already in the country. At 11:30 Eastern, senators will vote on tabling one of the 5 amendments lined up for floor action today. Just which amendment has yet to be announced. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. O divine Redeemer, who stands outside the closed doors of human hearts, knocking repeatedly, give our lawmakers the grace to open themselves to you. May they open their ears in order to receive your wisdom and to follow your plan. May they open their eyes so that they can see the unfolding of your loving providence in our nation and world. Lord, may they open their minds to welcome creative strategies for making America a shining example of your purposes. May they open their hands, sharing their blessings to enrich humankind. May they open their hearts so that you can keep them from deviating from the path of integrity. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 20th, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, I ask consent that the Senate resume consideration S-744, the Comprehensive Immigration Bill, and I ask that the time until noon be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or the designees, and that I be recognized at noon.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I indicated last night that I was going to create a vote at 11:30 this morning, but Senators Mikulski and Shelby have asked that we put that over a little bit, so we're going to do that at noon because they're having an important markup on the Appropriations Committee. So we'll continue to work through amendments to the bill today. Hopefully we could have at that time at noon, have a path forward on this legislation. We have a number of amendments that are now pending. We'd hope to have a way of disposing of those. And I hope there's something can be worked out. Senator Landrieu and others have indicated they want some amendments. And I hope that we can work that out so that we can move forward on the bill. So we'll continue to work through the amendments as I indicated today. The first roll call vote, as I indicated, will be about noon today. Excuse me, Mr. President. We've made some significant advances on the historic immigration legislation that's now before us. I'm confident and I'm hopeful that we can pass this bill. I've indicated on a number of occasions that we're going to do everything within our power to finish this bill before the July 4th recess. I've had conversations with the Republican leader and other Republican senators and, of course, my Democratic senators, and I think that's the goal, and I have no reason that we shouldn't be able to meet that goal. We've made progress on amendments. I expect and I hope that a group of Republican senators working with the Gang of Eight will come forward with a way that they think we can move forward on this bill dealing with border. And as I've said all along, I'm willing to look at any reasonable amendment. I think we all are. And I hope that something can be worked out with my Republican colleagues and the Gang of Eight. I've said before, and I say it again, I appreciate very much the Gang of Eight for their diligent work, both in crafting this legislation and shepherding it through this transparent and thorough process. And it goes without saying that the chairman of the committee, Senator Leahy, has been remarkably focused on how to get this done. And, Mr. President, one of my favorite senators that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years has been Chuck Grassley, the senator from Iowa. He's a ranking member of that committee. And even though we disagree on occasion on how to move forward, I never remember having an unpleasant conversation with Chuck Grassley. So I appreciate his working on this. As I've indicated, he and Senator Leahy don't agree on parts of this immigration bill, but that's the way things are and should be in this legislation and all legislation. But he's been cooperative in helping us meet his expectations and move forward. Mr. President, a century ago, a person born in the United States could reasonably expect to live to their late 40s. I repeat, 100 years ago, a person born in the United States could reasonably expect to live to their late 40s. Today, most people born in the United States can live till their late 70s and early 80s. That's the way it is. Look how things have changed over these last 100 years. Imagine adding more than 3 decades of life expectancy just in this period of time. This gift is due to a number of things, but the most significant reason is that we've had 125 years of research done by one of the great institutions of America, the National Institutes of Health. Due to their research, fewer people die of cancer, for example, each year than the year before. It's stunning, Mr. President, the advances that we've made. If one looks at their personal life, the things that have happened in your families, think what it would have been a few years ago. A terrible automobile accident or a dread disease like cancer. Think of the work that's been done by these scientists to help us advance the cause of curing people. Over the last half-century, deaths from heart disease and stroke have fallen by 60%. That's just in 50 years. Because of the work done there, thanks to the Institutes of Health, scientists understand the heart about as well as any part of your body. Now these wonderful scientists are now beginning to study the brain. Much more complicated than the heart, but still, the heart's very complicated. They're going to begin a study on this to find out everything that they can about the brain. The most extensive research project in the world is dealing with the brain. It's going to be, and it's already started at the National Institutes of Health. Mr. President, antiviral therapies developed by NIH-funded projects and researchers. Now they have diagnosed HIV, AIDS, to the extent that when I was out there on Monday, and I talked to him about someone when I first came to the Senate that was diagnosed with AIDS. That was a death sentence. Not anymore, because of the work done there. They can count their life expectancy in multiple decades, when in the past it was months. It would be impossible to count the lives that NIH Innovation has already saved. And researchers are not close to realizing the limits of modern medicine. I was fortunate to have the opportunity, as I indicated, to visit the facility on Monday morning. These facilities in Bethesda, Maryland are stunningly important to visit, to witness the fascinating work that they do there. I toured the clinic, one of the clinics where the best medical researchers in the world are trying to solve the world's most elusive medical mysteries. There's 27 different institutes that make up the National Institutes of Health. They're studying diseases that have yet to be identified, let alone be cured. They have one institute, that's what they deal with, on diseases they don't know what the cause of them is. They have, I met a little girl there, 7 years old, beautiful child. They're trying to figure out why she has the problem she has. They've made some progress, but they don't know yet. And once they identify, and they've found reasons in that young lady and others that are certain things that are missing, and I'm not a scientist, and I can't probably do justice to this, but there are certain things in the body, gene sequencing in the body, that something's missing, or something's added, like a protein that shouldn't be there. Now, they can identify this, and that's tremendous that they can do that. But on a number of these diseases, they're still, even though they've identified what causes it, they don't know for sure how to fix it. That's what they're doing there. In addition to the work being conducted by the nearly 6,000 scientists that work there, these are labs located on their campus, and it's a huge campus. They award not only to the work that they do there, but they award thousands of grants each year to more than 300,000 researchers across the country. Most of them are university-based, but not all of them. These scientists are seeking the next breakthrough for treatments that they can do with drugs and even cures. They're reaching out for the next advancement will, to borrow Abraham Lincoln's words, add years to our lives as well as life to our years. But today, the crucial life-saving work at NIH is in jeopardy. The arbitrary, across-the-board cuts of the mean and arbitrary sequester have hit NIH very, very hard. The institutes have cut $1.55 billion from their budget this year alone. Think of the work that is not being done there because of that. The little girl that I met there. Think of the work that is not going to be done with little girls and boys like her, because there's this year alone, $1.5 billion cut from their program. What this means, among other things, NIH will award 700 fewer grants this year than last, putting the next revolutionary treatment at risk, whatever it might be. And faced with diminished funding opportunities and an uncertain future, promising young scientists are abandoning the research field altogether. The person that is the director of the National Institutes of Health is Dr. Francis Collins, the father of the gene sequencing that we now look in the future to curing literally every disease. This wonderful man, who, Mr. President, could make a fortune by moving out of his scientific endeavors, has decided that's his life's work. But not only does Dr. Collins feel that way, but everyone that works there. They're doing things to help us, our families, our friends, America, and literally the world. And it's very, very sad to me that these wonderful people are dedicating their lives to not how much money they can make, but how much better they can make people feel and what they can do to cure diseases, are looking for other places. Mr. President, someone that works for me here in Washington, his best friend is one of the leading experts, if not the leading expert in the world on a disease called melanoma, cancer. And he's not applying for grants anymore at NIH because you can't do this work on a 1 to 2 year basis. It has to be a long term so you can do the research. It's happening all over. And not only that, Mr. President, people who work there are leaving the institution. NIH researchers are currently studying cancer drugs that zero in on a tumor with fewer sickening side effects. And I say that, sickening side effects. The Capitol physician is a wonderful man, Dr. Brian Monahan. He was a professor, taught medicine. He's a Navy admiral, and he is board certified in hematology, internal medicine, and oncology. And as some know, my wife has been through a pretty brutal bout with breast cancer. He told me that, and Lander was really sick lots of times, really, really sick. But he said, just a few years ago, they had to admit women to the hospital because they couldn't stop vomiting because of the medicine they were taking. We've made progress there. That doesn't happen often anymore, Mr. President. As sick as my wife was, she wasn't as sick as she would have been a few years ago. At this wonderful facility, they're developing a vaccine that could fight every strain of influenza without a yearly shot, saving money and lives. The man head of the institute's there on a blackboard, really a green board, with a piece of chalk. He drew a picture and which showed me and my staff what happens when influenza strikes. And the reason we need now a yearly shot for flu. But we're very close to having one shot to take care of flu all the time. This flu isn't anything to not worry about. 1918, 100 million people died because of flu around the world. 100 million. So we have a couple of brands of flu right now that are potentially very, very damaging. And these scientists are very close to having a vaccine that will take care of flu shots, take care of flu with one shot for always. They're conducting clinical trials that will help identify and treat those at risk of developing early onset Alzheimer's, leading to more successful treatment of this costly and debilitating disease. Mr. President, many, many years ago, I was at an event in Las Vegas, and next to me was a physician, and I was a new senator, and he said, you and Congress need to do something about Alzheimer's, otherwise you're going to bankrupt America. And with people living longer, there's more Alzheimer's coming all the time. We've made progress. We still have a long ways to go. These innovations have the possibility not only to save lives, but to save us all billions of dollars each year on medical care. The NIH has made an intellectual and economic leader the world over. Everybody looks at NIH as the premier research facility for disease. But the senseless, meat-axe, unfair cuts that we call sequester puts all NIH does at risk. Mr. President, as we, this wonderful, great country of ours, is slashing investments in medical research, slashing, our competitors are redoubling their efforts. China, 25% increase in medical research. We're cutting billions. In just 2 years with this sequester deal, we will cut almost $4 billion China's increasing theirs by 25%. India by 20%. South Korea, Germany, Brazil, 10%. And we're whacking ours, cutting them. These wonderful, wonderful scientists. As these countries, and all they're trying to do is try to duplicate our success, replicate our success. We're banning, while they're doing that, we're abandoning the investments that brought us to where we are. But medical innovation does not happen overnight. It takes years of research, years of trial, and years of error, quite frankly, years of process elimination. One of the institute directors, he talked about spinal cord injuries. We're making progress. But something they thought a few years ago worked really well, further tests said it works only a little bit, not like they thought it would. Even when scientists know the cause of a disease, as I've indicated, they've figured out some of this with gene sequencing, it takes an average of 13 years to develop a drug to treat that. These short-sighted cuts to research funding will cost us valuable cures tomorrow. And while these costs may not be felt this month, this year, or even this decade, their long-term consequences will be grave. Now, we say may not be felt this month. For the scientists working there, they're going to feel it really quick, because some of them are leaving, Mr. President. Imagine if we had neglected our commitment to finding effective treatments for cancer, heart disease, or stroke a few decades ago. Imagine if we had abandoned investment in treatments for HIV and AIDS in the 80s and 90s. Think the burden that would have been not only on people that are sick and dying, but the burden that would have been on our economy because of the huge costs of lost time at work and all the medical stuff. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Imagine, Mr. President, life's cut short. We can all agree that reducing our deficit is a valuable goal, and we've done a good job, $2.5 trillion. But we should reduce the deficit by making smart investments, not by making short-sighted cuts that cause pain and suffering and death. There's simply no price tag you can put on that, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
A few months back, one of our Democratic colleagues warned of a huge train wreck on the horizon, the implementation of Obamacare. And yesterday we received another warning as Obamacare speeds down the tracks. This one came from the Government Accounting Office, which highlighted a number of missed deadlines that cast doubt on the ability of the administration to even get the law up and running by October 1st. Of course, the GAO is not the first to issue such warnings. Some of us have been sounding a similar call literally for years. And what we've said is that Obamacare is set to become a bureaucratic nightmare. Most of the law's key provisions haven't even been implemented yet. Not a single American has signed up for an exchange, and already it's turning into one big mess. It wasn't hard to see this coming. We're talking about a 2,700-page piece of legislation. We're talking about a law that's already generated more than 20,000 pages of regulations, literally a red tape tower, 7 feet tall. And we're talking about an edict that proposes to alter one of the most personal, most private aspects of our lives in a fundamental way. So it doesn't take an expert to understand what that leads to. Reams of paperwork, massive new bureaucracy, the coordination of numerous hulking government agencies, including, of course, the IRS. And it can't be done without the people the government is attempting to regulate, the doctors, the hospitals, states, small businesses, hundreds of millions of Americans actually having a clue how to comply. Nobody knows how to comply with this thing. The law is just maddeningly complex. So, of course, Obamacare is going to be a mess. Going to be a mess. We said it would be, and actually it already is. And yet, earlier this month, the President said that Obamacare was, quote, working the way it's supposed to, end quote. That is literally what he said. Maybe that's why just yesterday a survey of Americans showed only 19%, fewer than 1 in 5, believe that Obamacare will make their family better off. Only 19%. And it found a much greater number, roughly half of Americans, worried about losing the health care coverage they already have. Now, there was another survey released, too, a survey of small business owners. It found that 41% of small business owners said they'd frozen hiring, literally quit hiring people, because of Obamacare. 41% of small businesses. About 20% said they'd already reduced their workforces because of it. 40% quit hiring people, 20% reducing workforce because of Obamacare. And remember, this is a law that's still being implemented, and that many businesses already seem to be laying people off. I hope that's not a preview of what we'll see once Obamacare actually comes online. But given the evidence thus far, it's hard to draw a different conclusion. The Kentucky Retail Federation recently cited Obamacare as the thing having the most impact on their business's ability to grow. As a leader of that group put it, the companies in his federation are hesitant to take on new staff or to invest in their own business growth until they know how much health care reform is going to cost. So if this is the law that's working the way it's supposed to, then it's obviously a very bad law. And it's Congress' duty to repeal bad laws, and I hope that it will. I hope my Democratic friends here in the Senate will finally work with us to do that, do just that, because we can't do it without them. They have the majority, and if they can muster the will to admit their mistake, I hope they can also find the will to work with us to start fresh on health care. This time, I hope they will actually work together with Republicans to get something done for the American people. In my view, that means pursuing effective, step-by-step reforms that can not only lower costs, but that can also be implemented effectively and understood completely by constituents we were sent here to serve. I know my constituents back in Kentucky would expect as much of us, and frankly, they should expect that much of us. Now, Mr. President, on another matter that I've talked repeatedly about over the last few weeks, there's a cloud hanging over the Senate, an unease throughout the Senate, entirely on the Republican side and some on the Democratic side as well. And that is this. We had a discussion at the beginning of this Congress about what the rules of the Senate would be for this Congress, this year and next year. After that bipartisan discussion, we passed 2 rules changes and 2 standing orders, and the majority leader said we had determined what the rules of the Senate were going to be for the next 2 years. He gave his word that we would not break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules of the Senate, the so-called nuclear option. And yet he continued to hint that maybe that was not what he had in mind. And so what I and my colleagues are asking the majority leader to do is to stand by his word. Your word is the currency of the realm here in the Senate. We expect the majority leader to keep his word. His word was given unequivocally in January of this year. In fact, it was given in January 2 years before that for the next 2 Congresses. So it's time to lift this cloud that's hanging over the Senate, for all the members of the Senate to understand what the rules are for this Congress, because we already made that decision back in January, and we await the majority leader finally addressing the matter and making it clear that his word is good. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 80.
Between the majority and the minority. Republican whip.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 45 minutes between now and the time that a vote is scheduled this morning on my amendment.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I won't be taking all that time right now. I'll reserve some of that time, and hopefully other colleagues will come down to the floor and engage in a discussion. But as you know, Mr. President, for the last few days I've been talking about the importance of border security in this immigration bill. And just to remind anybody who happens to be listening, I come from a state, Texas, that has the longest common border with the country of Mexico, 1,200 miles. And while many of our colleagues, or some of our colleagues, come from states like California, where San Diego, they like the fence that they have there that they view as restricting illegal immigration and entry into the country. Tucson and Arizona has a little different situation because much of the land is federal land. In Texas, our 1,200-mile common border with Mexico is largely private property on the Texas side, and it also is enormously diverse. You can go out to West Texas near Alpine, where Big Bend National Park is, where you'll see huge cliffs that go some 1,000 feet down to the Rio Grande River. And while some have said, well, we need a fence across the entire border, I dare say that putting a fence on a 1,000-foot cliff is not going to enhance border security much. So what I've argued for from the beginning is the need for a comprehensive border security plan and for Congress to make a sincere and enforceable commitment to follow through on that plan. I do believe that in the 6 years since the last time we debated immigration reform in 2007, I do believe there is an emerging consensus in the country. Now, many people are mad, and they deserve to be mad, about the federal government's failure to live up to its promises when it comes to our broken immigration system. You can go back to 1986, when Ronald Reagan, the father of modern conservatism in the Republican Party, he signed an amnesty for 3 million people. And his rationale was, well, we're going to enforce our immigration system, so this will be the first and last time any president will have to sign an amnesty. Well, we know that the enforcement component of that didn't work. That promise was not kept, causing a lot of deeply seated skepticism in the American people whether Congress and Washington can be depended upon to keep its commitments when it comes to enforcing our laws and securing our borders. But my amendment that we will be voting on perhaps as early as noon today is designed to turn border security rhetoric into reality. More specifically, what it adds is a trigger. We've been talking about triggers to the Gang of Eight bill, the underlying bill, but it would require the federal government to have 100% situational awareness of our border, the southwestern border, and we can do that from Border Patrol, radar, ground sensors, using all of the magnificent technology the Defense Department and our military has produced. Amazing American innovators have produced that our military has used effectively in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't believe there's any doubt, and I know the Gang of Eight, the people who wrote the underlying bill, believe that 100% situational awareness of our border is possible and it's attainable if we have the political will to make it happen and if our law enforcement authorities are provided the appropriate resources to do it. So 100% situational awareness is one of the requirements. The second is operational control. Right now, we don't have control of our southwestern border. The latest General Accounting Office estimate is only about 45% of our southwestern border is under operational control. For example, just a few weeks ago, I was in South Texas in Brooks County in deep Rio Grande Valley, in the Rio Grande Valley sector of the Border Patrol, visiting with them. On one day, and they detained 700 people coming across the southwestern border in the Rio Grande sector. 400 of them came from countries other than Mexico. Some of the rescue beacons that they have down there for people who are in distress, these are immigrants who are coming from Central America, coming from around the world through our southwestern border into the United States. The rescue beacons they have down there that I saw with my own eyes, where if people get in big trouble and they realize that they may lose their life unless they call the Border Patrol to come help them, are in English, Spanish, and, get this, Chinese. Chinese. This is in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. I asked the local law enforcement authorities, I said, why Chinese? They said, well, for a while we got a whole lot of Chinese immigrants coming across the border being smuggled across into the United States. And I said, well, what is the going rate? You have to pay the coyotes, as they call them, or the smugglers. They said about $30,000. So for $30,000, somebody from China can get somebody to smuggle them into the United States, which is the reason why those rescue beacons were in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And indeed, the Border Patrol statistics reveal that we have people have come across the border in the last year from 100 different countries around the world. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity as a member of the Armed Services Committee to ask the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency whether this porous border was a national security issue. Both of them said it was, which is pretty obvious, because we know that if people from 100 different countries can penetrate our southwestern border because of a lack of appropriate security there, they can come, if they've got the money and they're determined enough, they can come from anywhere in the world, including countries that are state sponsors of terrorism. So operational control of the border is very important. Third, my amendment offers a real trigger that requires a nationwide biometric entry-exit system. Now, that sounds a little obscure. Basically, what happens when you come to the United States from another country, you're required to give fingerprints. That's a biometric identifier, because you can't use phony documents or a fuzzy picture to claim to be somebody you're not and get into the country illegally. You got to have a, and the importance of the biometric entry-exit system was noted particularly by the 9/11 Commission, because several of the people who were involved in the plot to kill 3,000 Americans on September the 11th, 2001, entered the country legally, but they never left. Hence the importance of a biometric entry-exit system to document not just when people come to America as tourists or students or whatever, but that they actually leave when their visa is expired. Right now, 40% of illegal immigration is a product of a failure to have an effective entry-exit system, because people come legally and they simply stay and melt into the great American landscape. And unless they come in contact with our law enforcement officials, they commit a crime, they driving while intoxicated, domestic violence, or the like, they're never going to be caught. And then fourth, my amendment requires nationwide E-Verify. Now, E-Verify is the name given to a system that all federal offices have to comply with. For example, when somebody wants to be hired in my Senate office, either in Texas or up here in D.C., we're required by law to run their name through the E-Verify system to verify that this person is legally eligible to work in the United States. And that's an important part of the provisions in my amendment that provide real triggers. Now, let me talk a moment about triggers, because you're going to hear a lot of discussion about a trigger. A trigger is more than a promise. We know that there's a litany, indeed there's a trail of broken promises when it comes to our immigration system that dates back to at least 1986. What a trigger means is that there is an enforceable mechanism that will prevent people from transitioning, in the case of my amendment, from probationary status to legal permanent residency until the objectives set out in the underlying bill, 100% of situational awareness and operational control are met, together with a biometric entry-exit system and nationwide E-Verify. I want to emphasize that my amendment uses the same standard, metrics, and targets as the underlying bill. The difference between my amendment and their bill is that their bill promises the sun and the moon when it comes to border security, E-Verify, entry-exit, but it has no enforceable mechanism. And I ask the question, why should the American people trust Congress? Why should the American people trust Washington to enforce this part of the essential bargain, the security part of the bargain, if it has failed to do so in the past? And I would suggest to you that given the current trust deficit here in Washington, with scandals everywhere, that we can't reasonably expect the American people to just rely on trust us. We need something enforceable, which is what my amendment provides. The trigger in my amendment is not designed to punish people, but what it is, it's designed to realign incentives. So everybody from conservatives to liberals to people in the middle of the road, Republicans, Democrats, you name it, everybody's incentivized to hit the standard set out in the underlying bill, 100% situational awareness and operational control. Over the past few days, I've cited a number of experts, and we in the Senate have a lot of experts. We have people from different states, some of whom, to be honest, know more about the subject than others. But I've cited a couple of experts, including the former head of Customs and Border Protection and the former Undersecretary for Border and Transportation Security at the Department of Homeland Security, all of whom believe that the border security requirements in my amendment, and again I stress in the underlying bill, are reasonable and realistic. And no fewer than 3 members of the Gang of 8, Senators Bennett from Colorado, a Democrat, Senator Flake from Arizona, a Republican, and Senator McCain, a Republican from Arizona, have all said that the 90% apprehension rate for illegal border crossers is a perfectly attainable goal. Senator McCain 2 days ago said he had talked to the head of the Border Patrol that said that this is a perfectly realistic goal, 100% situational awareness and operational control. And I agree with that. So if the goal is attainable, why not make it mandatory? Why not go beyond the usual promises and platitudes and demand actual results? That's what my amendment does. It demands results, and it creates a mechanism that ensures that those results will be delivered. And again, this is designed to realign all of the incentives so all of us are absolutely focused like a laser in ensuring that the executive branch and the bureaucracy will do what the bill promises will be done. If we are able to accomplish that, I believe the American people are a compassionate people. They understand that we have a very difficult hand to play here because we haven't enforced our immigration laws for many years now. But if they believe sincerely that this will end the illegality in our broken immigration system, if this will return law and order to our broken immigration system, I believe they will accept dealing with the 11 million people here in a humane and compassionate way. If you think our immigration system is broken, as I do, and if you think the status quo is unacceptable, that doing nothing is not the answer, then I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment, because it's the only way, I believe, to get truly bipartisan and, even more important than that, truly effective immigration reform. Mr. President, I want to spend if I may ask the Chair how much time I have remaining.
30 minutes.
I thank the presiding officer. Mr. President, as I mentioned a few moments ago, I'm going to spend a few additional minutes talking about a portion of my amendment that hasn't received much attention because we've been focused so much on the border security component. Indeed, I think most Americans would be shocked to learn that the underlying bill would allow the people eligible for immediate legalization under the Gang of Eight bill would include people with multiple drunk driving convictions. Indeed, the bill even legalizes drunk drivers who've already been deported, amazingly enough. Just for perspective, in the year 2011, Immigration and Customs Enforcement deported nearly 36,000 people with DUI, driving under the influence convictions. The problem is especially bad in Houston, Texas, where I was born. Just last month, a Harris County Sheriff's officer, a sergeant named Dwayne Polk, was killed by an illegal immigrant drunk driver who had previously been arrested for driving under the influence and illegally carrying a weapon. After his earlier arrest, he was deported, but he eventually came back to Houston and once again drove while intoxicated, with tragic results, where Sergeant Dwayne Polk lost his life. In May of 2011, Houston police officer Kevin Will was killed by an illegal immigrant drunk driver who'd been deported to Mexico on several occasions. And in August 2007, an illegal immigrant drunk driver with a blood alcohol level 3 times above the legal limit killed 3 people in a Houston area freeway, including a husband, a wife, and their 2-year-old son. The driver who killed them was out on bail at the time of the accident after having been arrested for domestic violence. For that matter, not only does the underlying bill legalize immigrants with multiple drunk driving convictions, it also legalizes people with multiple domestic violence convictions. Domestic violence convictions. That's mind-boggling. I realize that some people, when they hear the word misdemeanor, they think you're talking about, jaywalking or a speeding ticket or something like that, or driving a car without a functioning taillight. But the truth is, and the former prosecutors in this chamber know, that the technical difference between a misdemeanor and a felony can be as little as 1 day additional time in prison. Typically, a misdemeanor is punished by no more than 1 year, potentially up to 1 year in jail, and anything over that is traditionally called a felony. More clearly, felonious conduct is often pleaded down to a misdemeanor, particularly in instances like domestic violence, where the victim is either married to or lives with the assailant, and there's difficulty getting cooperation, and sometimes the only thing the prosecutor can do, even in the case of very serious physical or other assault, is to get a misdemeanor conviction, even though the underlying circumstances are very serious indeed. There are numerous states that classify certain domestic violence crimes as misdemeanors, and there's a lot of variety in this, but that doesn't mean the conduct at issue is any less of a domestic violence offense. By my count, 23 states have specific misdemeanor domestic violence offenses. These include California, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Rhode Island, and South Carolina. Minnesota, for example, defines misdemeanor domestic assault this way: whoever against a family or household member commits an act with intent to cause fear in another of immediate bodily harm or death, or intentionally inflicts or attempts to inflict bodily harm on another. So I'm sure my colleagues from Minnesota know the crimes that qualify as misdemeanor domestic violence under Minnesota law include domestic abuse with a deadly weapon, even domestic abuse with a gun. And while it's called a misdemeanor in the statute books, it's obviously a very serious underlying offense. I'd love it if some member of this chamber would explain why conduct like this should not be a bar to the generous opportunity afforded in the bill to obtain probationary status and earn, eventually, a pathway to citizenship. Why should we include people like this who've shown so much contempt for our laws? We're not just talking about people who've come here to work in violation of our immigration laws. We're talking about people who've come here in violation of our immigration laws and who've also committed serious offenses. We should have zero tolerance for anyone who enters our country and commits such a heinous act. America has always been a deeply compassionate and understanding society, and nothing has changed. But when it comes to granting legal status to people who violated our immigration laws, our criteria should be very clear. No drunk drivers and no violent criminals. Period. My amendment guarantees that, which is just one more reason why this chamber should embrace it. Mr. President, for now, I just want to conclude by saying I read in the press, including the New York Times, there's a story by Ashley Parker dated June 19, 2013, says 2 GOP senators are close to a deal on border security. And it cites the efforts of my colleagues Bob Corker of Tennessee and John Hoeven of North Dakota, who have been working behind the scenes to try to improve the border security component of the underlying bill. I applaud them for their efforts, and I applaud them for moving the underlying bill in a more positive direction when it comes to border security. I'm going to wait final judgment until we actually see language, because the devil is so often in the details on things like this. But I would just point out that just before their efforts, which now reportedly would include an additional 20,000 Border Patrol agents, I would point out that the underlying bill had 0 additional Border Patrol agents, 0 additional boots on the ground. My amendment adds 5,000 Border Patrol agents, and now reportedly, and again, we need to see the details, the proposal by Senator Corker and Senator Hoeven would add 20,000 additional Border Patrol agents. But just to show what a dramatic change that's been, Senator Schumer, one of the chief architects of the underlying bill, in a speech on June the 12th said, whatever CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, says, 6,500 border agents is a multi-billion-dollar proposition, unpaid for, which is why I know my colleagues on the other side rue the day when we vote for unpaid obligations. Again, he said, this is on June the 12th, how can you manufacture 3,500 new personnel and say it doesn't add to the cost and will be reallocated? I want to know where it's going to be reallocated from. Similarly, my colleague Senator McCain said, but those who think that we need more people, we do need more people to facilitate movement across the ports of entry. But we have 21,000 Border Patrol. Today there are in the Mexico-Arizona border people sitting in vehicles in 120-degree heat. He said in a speech on June the 18th, he said, what we need is not more people. He went on to say, but the fact is we can get this border secured, and the answer, my friends, is, as is proposed in the Cornyn Amendment, that we hire 10,000 more Border Patrol. He said that's not a recognition of what we really need. Finally, he said, no expert I've talked to say that the best way to control people from crossing the border illegally, which I desperately want to do, works better with a huge amount of personnel. So I just point those comments out by Senator Schumer and Senator McCain, 2 of the leading members of the Gang of 8, their comments on June the 12th. So if it's true, as reported in the New York Times and elsewhere, that Senator Corker and Senator Hoeven have moved them off of the 0 additional Border Patrol to doubling the size of the Border Patrol, that's a substantial movement in terms of boots on the ground. I'll just conclude by now for saying this. I'm looking forward to seeing the language that's being proposed, the alternative language. But for now, I believe my amendment deserves the support of the members of this chamber, because I believe it's the only way we have available to us to ensure our constituents, to be able to look them in the face and say, we know we've broken promises in the past when it comes to border security. We know we promised 17 years ago there'd be a biometric entry-exit system when President Clinton signed that into law. But you know what? We didn't do it. But we're serious about doing the enforcement and security measures now, and in fact, we put a provision in the bill which will guarantee it, and that's what my amendment will do. So, Mr. President, I would reserve the remainder of my time. And note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd ask that the time in quorum calls be equally divided among the Democrats and Republicans in the chamber.
Without objection.
And again, Mr. President, I'd note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.